episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in. If you have a question or comment about today's show, email it to comment@am950radio.com, and I'll answer it on the air. So we're continuing our journey through the Constitution. Right now we're in the amendments. We're into the 20s now. Again, we have 27 amendments. So we're getting towards the end of it here. So today we're going to do the 21st Amendment. And one way to remember what is in the 21st Amendment is like you think of the legal drinking age. Okay, because the 21st Amendment is the amendment where they repealed the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition. All right, so today we're going to talk about the 21st Amendment on repealing prohibition and some of the things about why they did that, some of the politics behind it, and why. And this is kind of one thing that kind of shows you how, when it comes to writing some laws, and in this case an amendment, it's sometimes hard to legislate morality. So this is an example of how they tried to do it, but it kind of backfired on them. So let's get into the 21st Amendment. So, this is one that was passed in the 1930s. Okay, this is another one of those. I think there was like two of them passed in the 30s. So, again, only 27 amendments, after starting it in 1789. So there's not a lot of amendments when you actually look at it, especially if you compare it to other countries. But this amendment, this particular one, is the first of its kind for three main reasons. Okay, number one is it directly repealed a prior amendment. Again, that was the 18th Amendment, which instituted prohibition. So this is the first one to get rid of a prior amendment. Secondly, it was ratified by 3/4 of the states by their state conventions, not by their state legislatures. All right, so we've covered before how under Article 5 in the Constitution, there's two ways to ratify a proposed amendment. Either you do it through 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 3/4 of the states through a state convention. The difference here is that through a state convention, it's actually not all the legislative politicians voting on it. It's people can elect their own delegates to these state conventions, like they did to the Constitutional Convention, and then those people vote on it. So this is the only one of the 27 where it was ratified by 3/4 of the states through a state convention. And this was done on purpose. I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But this is the only one out of those amendments. And another thing here is that this is an amendment where the amendment outlaws certain things at the federal level, but then lets states continue to legislate, in this case, against alcohol if they want to. So this is a new thing, too. And, a lot of the amendments we've talked about don't have this. Well, it's bad at the federal level, but okay at the state level, or vice versa. This is one of them. I think it's probably the only one that has language like this. So I'll go through the text here in just a minute, but basically it says, okay, prohibition is no longer something at the federal level, but states can still ban it if they want to, and some states did. So there's no other amendment like this either. So this is a real this 21st Amendment is real unique in these three circumstances. And some people, like when we covered this amendment in my class, for example, they relate this to like recreational marijuana and medical marijuana, where at the federal level it's illegal. All marijuana use and possession is illegal under federal law, but under the states, under more and more and more states, it's legal, at least for medicinal purposes. I think now a large number of states have it legal for medicinal purposes, and more, like Minnesota did recently, are doing it for recreational use. So, even though it's still illegal under federal law, it's still fine. The states can do something different if they want, because the federal government is staying out of it, basically, even though it's illegal under federal law. So, the amendment itself, it's very simple. The Section 1 basically says the 18th Amendment is hereby repealed. Okay, real simple. Section 2 is where the amendment allows state laws or territory laws, because there were still some territories in the United States at that point, and still today, but they let the territories, if the territories want to do it, they can legislate here too. They can still ban the transportation or importation of intoxicating liquor into those states or territories under Section 2. Now, again, similar to the 18th Amendment, it doesn't say anything about possession or using intoxicating liquor, but states did that on their own too. But here they're talking about transportation or importation of intoxicating liquors. So Section 2 is the part where, if states want to do it, if states still want to ban this stuff, they can. And then Section 3 is something that we've seen previously, where Congress puts a time limit for ratifying this particular amendment. So this one says 7 years is the time that Congress gave the state conventions. So again, this isn't state legislatures like all the other amendments. This is state conventions. Have 7 years to do it. And they didn't need 7 years. They didn't even need 1 year to get enough states at this time in 36 states to get rid of prohibition. So again, this was a pretty short period of time needed to repeal this. So remember that the 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919. Okay, and then it was repealed by the 21st Amendment on December 5th, 1933. So there was about 15 years or so that we had prohibition. So what happened here? Why 15 years later get rid of it? Something that over 3/4 of the states had ratified back in 1919. Now, there were a number of things. I'm not going to go through all of them here, but I'm going to go through some of the main reasons. So, of course, number one is people were drinking more booze, right? Remember what's going on in history at that point. Okay, in the 1920s, known as the Roaring '20s, right? This was, generally good times. People had, they were doing a lot of partying, had a lot of money at that point, at least some portion of the population, right? And they were spending it partying, drinking booze. There were a bunch of speakeasies, they were called, that, even though prohibition was in place, there still was a lot of these bars, but they call them speakeasies, that were serving alcohol to people. So during the 1920s, people were just drinking anyway. And I'll get back to that here in just a minute. But then remember, towards the end of the 20s, and then definitely in the 30s, then the Depression hits, right? Which usually, and in this case I think it's true too, when bad things happen, people tend to drink more, right? Because they want to basically self-medicate. One of the ways they did it was drinking booze. And so the people that weren't drinking in the 20s, let's say, a number of them started in the 30s when, things were getting bad for them. And so again, there were just more and more people consuming alcohol in this time. So a lot of people were pushing getting rid of that. Including the, makers of the alcohol, right? It's like, This is a way for them to make more money, a lot more money, to get rid of this amendment. So, of course, they were lobbying and, doing all this to try and get Congress to propose this amendment, which it did, and then got the state conventions to ratify the repeal of prohibition. So that's one reason, is people were just drinking more. Second one is the rise of organized crime, right, and crime in general. So, you probably all heard of Al Capone, right, and the organized crime. This was, when Prohibition happened, a lot of organized crime people, a lot of those families, so to speak, right, they got in. This is what they got into, among other things, was alcohol. All right, so there were a lot of people already drinking, as I mentioned before. So there was a lot of people breaking the law. There were lots of people, a lot of the law enforcement people, not enforcing these laws, particularly out in the rural areas and things like that, because they were just simply bought off by organized crime, or bought off by the the manufacturers. Or a lot of law enforcement officers back then, they were okay with making alcohol. Probably some of them did it themselves, right? But you saw a lot of organized crime, and just crime in general started to get bad because nobody's obeying the law. There's lots of corruption in law enforcement. There was corruption in the legal system. There were certainly at that point judges and prosecutors who were corrupt. And people saw that, well, we're almost wasting resources, and this just isn't happening. One of the things that it also did during this time frame is the FBI was one of the main law enforcement groups here. They had to bring on more officers and do all this stuff to try to enforce these laws, which cost the country more money. Right? All of these things, like when government tries to do these things, it all costs more money to try and enforce, and implement, these changes in the law. It's not done for free. And because, the Depression's going on here when you're getting into the 30s, a way to save some money, if you will, is to legalize alcohol use. Use the FBI for something else. Third thing is when there were a lot of people who were against this. So you even had a lot of people on juries that just let people off. Even though they violated a law, they just didn't convict them. And when people were convicted, a lot of people, again, particularly in rural areas, got mad about it. Because, a lot of them were like, why is the government doing this? This is not a proper role for government, all that sort of stuff. Another reason is that there's a lack of tax money for the government during the Depression. Right? Before Prohibition, and even after nowadays, right? Government taxes booze and all kinds of other things. But because they had Prohibition, they weren't collecting all this tax money. So this lack of tax money for the government during the Depression when they needed some more money, right? This is another reason to argue to get rid of Prohibition. Another reason is Congress themselves started opening up some loopholes. So, for example, one example here is FDR when he was first elected, and Congress changed the Volstead Act, which dealt with what's intoxicating liquor and what isn't. They made an exception for the 3.2 beer. They made that legal, and which was a huge loophole. All right, and people were questioning, well, if that's legal, why are we wasting resources on some trying to enforce the other part too? So, and then finally, again, legalizing morality is hard. In the end, people wanted to drink booze, just like people today want to drink booze. Even though, there's all kinds of studies out there about how bad alcohol is for us and how, the millions of people who are addicted to it, a bunch of, DWI killings, We know a lot of the, negative stuff here about alcohol, but as a society, we have decided we want to drink legally. Right? And now you're starting to see it more with marijuana, right? Society's views change. And at that point, it's like, hey, trying to legalize morality is hard to do. So another group of people just argued, hey, this just isn't working out, so this isn't going to work. So these were about 6 or so reasons why the amendment was successful in getting rid of prohibition. Now, some states still banned alcohol even after this amendment was passed. So at that point in time, 18 of them had laws banning alcohol. Mississippi was the last one, and they got rid of the ban in 1966. So it wasn't that long ago. And let's not forget, for years, right, Minnesota had a Sunday liquor law ban where you couldn't go buy booze on Sundays. Right, that was kind of part of this, right? And that went away in 2017. So again, not that long ago. But you can buy it now on Sundays. But even today, there's some smaller local areas, some counties in some states that still ban the use of alcohol. They're dry counties, is what they're called. So there's still places out there that have, banned this using of alcohol. So this ban happened pretty fast. Congress proposed it on February 20th, 1933. Again, took less than a year. December 5th, 1933, for enough states to ratify it. Again, they did this through state conventions because they feared with some of the state legislatures that the special interests would basically buy off the legislatures and get them to keep this in place. Because, there were still a lot of people who, liked the idea of prohibition. And they had some power in some states in their state legislatures. So this is why Congress, they said, no, we're going to make state conventions so that more of the people had more say in it, because they vote for who these delegates are going to be. It's not going to be, just the state legislature. So it got done pretty fast. So that was our failed attempt at banning alcohol for about 15 years. And just shows you some of the negatives about it and why it hasn't been tried since. All right, so that's it for the 21st Amendment. When we come back from the commercial break here, I'm going to talk some more about the big, beautiful bill that's going to hurt a lot of people. So we'll talk to you on the other side of the break. Welcome back to the second segment of the Politics Matters show, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in today. So, I talked last week about some of the cuts that are in this, what they call the Big Beautiful Bill, or whatever it is, which is not. I went through a lot of the cuts last week, and as far as I know, all of those are included. I mean, I don't think any of them got taken out of the final bill that passed the House of Representatives at the federal level. So now it's going to the Senate. That's where it is at the present time. But what I wanted to do today is talk specifically about the Medicaid program part of it. Because Republicans are simply lying about what's in this bill. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I saw an interview of Mike Johnson. I call him Mikey J, who's the Speaker of the House. He's from Louisiana, which plays a part in this, as I'll talk about here. basically goes on CNN, talks to Jake Tapper, who apparently, isn't on his book tour right now, saying about, how bad Biden is. And does a lousy job, by the way, during this interview. Doesn't push back on these lies at all. Just lets Johnson say whatever the hell he wants to say. So I'm going to respond to some of the lies that Mike Johnson said during that interview. I mean, there were a lot of them, so I picked out some of them here. Right. And, let's not forget the whole reason that they're going after the Medicaid program. And by the way, it's the Medicare program too. Don't let them lie to you about that either, because when they do these cuts, it's not going to be enough. Then they're going to go after the Medicare program. Okay, as I mentioned that a little bit last week. But right now, I'm just going to talk about the Medicaid program. Okay. What they're doing here is they're taking money from the poor people and they're transferring it to the rich people and to the military, right? Because remember, the military is the big winner here. They're going to have over $1 trillion budget. But all of this money is going to fund the tax break for the rich people and for the big corporations. So with the Medicaid program, I see numbers, and again, a lot of this, they're projections, they're estimates. They're not going to be exact numbers. But the one the Congressional Budget Office did, or the CBO as it's called, they're talking about 8 million people losing insurance if this bill goes through in its present form. And not only that, so these people are going to lose insurance altogether. And then you got about 10 million more or so that'll still have, still be on Medicaid, but they got to pay more. And I think, as I said last week, a lot of those people are going to lose their insurance because they can't afford these increased payments. They're going to have co-pays, right? Or they're going to have to pay more on their premiums, because some of them do pay premiums. Or they're going to start instituting premiums, just like, you pay with private health care. And people, remember, Medicaid is for poor people. And if you start adding all these costs to it, they're going to lose their coverage. Again, which is why I think these numbers are low. But here, Mike Johnson went on CNN again and just lied to the people. Okay, and he's done this before. This is something the Republicans love to do, right? Is they just go out and they lie on CNN or they lie on Fox News because nobody pushes back. I mean, they even lie on MSNBC, the so-called liberal station. But again, I've talked about MSNBC and how they're not. They're corporate media, just like, lots of other stations. But the point is here is he just goes on there and lies and nobody calls him out on it. And this time, Johnson's doing it with a smile on his face. I mean, you can just see him smirking when he's saying all these lies. Basically relishing what's going to happen to his own constituents in Louisiana if this bill passes. So he goes on CNN and says, "Oh, there's a lot of misinformation out there about the cuts." No, actually, there isn't, Mike. But just because you don't like what the people are saying, you call it misinformation. Now, I'm surprised he didn't say fake news, but he said misinformation. But, that's what he means. Okay, anything they don't like is fake news or misinformation. Now, here's the first lie. He claims that the people who are going to lose their insurance, their Medicaid coverage, right? All these people are going to lose it. These are the only people who are going to lose it are because they are committing, quote, fraud, waste, and abuse, close quote. Right? We hear this all the time. Fraud, waste, and abuse. Fraud, waste, and abuse. This is what the Doge program supposedly did. And there's no evidence to support that either. But apparently these 8 million people, if you use the number of the CBO, all 8 million of these people are committing waste, fraud, and abuse on the Medicaid system. Which, of course, is a lie. I'll come back to that here in a little bit as well. So that's his first lie. Another lie was saying that we got more than 1.4 million illegal aliens on Medicaid, close quote. No, that's not true, Mike. And you know it, too. Non-citizens, as I've said over and over and over again, aren't covered under Medicaid, or Medicare, for that matter, at the federal level. So this claim of 1.4 million illegal aliens on Medicaid is false. You need to be a citizen to get federal government aid. Now, as I've said before, there may be some states under our federalism system, right? There may be some states who have different health care programs, who have different requirements, different eligibilities. They may provide some health coverage under their state laws and using state money. But there's not 1.4 million illegal aliens on Medicaid, Mike. There just isn't. Not under the federal system, which is what he controls. He doesn't control the state governments and what they do with their own money. Now, he does have some control over how much money gets sent to the states to cover the Medicaid program, but states can have their own healthcare system, much like, medical assistance in Minnesota. Right? And, all the time Mike is on, saying these lies, Jake Tapper's just letting him talk. Probably, wondering where his next stop is on his book tour about how Biden is old. Like, we don't know that. But the lies don't stop there. Next one, Mikey J says, is 4.8 million people that are on Medicaid program right now should be working. Now, remember, as I said last week, they want to add a work requirement to Medicaid for poor people. And remember, a majority of people who are getting Medicaid are already working, Mikey, and you know this, Mike. But yet, here you go on national TV and lie to everybody's face again, and you will continue to do so. So he's saying that 4.8 million, I'll round it up to 5, okay, need to have they should be working. And then he goes on to say that these people, these 5 million people, are choosing, that's his word, quote, choosing not to work when they can. Now, again, he shows or cites no evidence to show that 5 million people can go out and work. And, okay, Mike, let's just assume that this is true. Where are these 5 million jobs going to come from? Okay, right now you got companies closing stores, or you got some laying off people because of this tariff mess that we're in. Where are you going to come up with 5 million jobs? Republicans, they love to push this work requirement. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to get people out working. They're going to be, productive members of society. I'll come back to this too here in a bit. But where are these jobs going to magically appear from? And, a lot of these people, let's face it, are in rural America. There's 5 million open jobs in rural America, Mike. Okay, tell us where they are. I want to know where they are. This is what Republicans love to do, right? They say this stuff all the time. Like, we can go out and work. Well, okay, where are the jobs? Are these companies actually going to hire these people? This is part of the problem with this whole work requirement stuff. But the reason that they're putting work requirements on, right, is to kick people off of Medicaid. This is a way to do it, and they can just say, well, we're not kicking people off of Medicaid. Well, when you add a work requirement, and there's been all kinds of studies about this. The latest one, go look at Arkansas, right, a big Republican state. Put a work requirement out there for their state stuff, and they're kicking people off right and left because the work requirements simply don't work. This is a way to kick people off without just saying we're kicking you off. And by the way, these 5 million people that you claim are choosing not to work, he's also saying they are, doing waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay. How can you, if you are currently eligible, like these 5 million people are, how can you be charged with fraud, Mikey? Your arguments make no sense. And remember, a lot of them are already working. It's not a crime if they're not working. There is no work requirement right now for Medicaid. But again, this is why they're trying to put one on, is to kick people off. This is part of the game that they're playing. Okay, then he goes on and says another lie. And I'm quoting here. The morality of what we are doing here is precisely right. Close quote. Really? Kicking poor people out of health care so that you can give a huge tax cut to rich people is moral, is precisely right? What universe do you live in, Mikey? Okay, I guess you've made one up. This is what Fox Lies does, right? It just makes up a whole new universe for people. And guess he's living in it. But he's not done. The lies keep coming. Then he goes on to say, public polling supports what we're doing. Now, I don't know what polls he's looking at, because I've looked at a lot of polls, and I'm not seeing what he's claiming here. He's saying that, quote, everyone polled, close quote, on whether single men without kids should work support the work requirement. No, they don't. Not the polls I've seen on this, Mike. A majority of people oppose this. A majority of the people, and even Republicans, by the way. Last one I saw was like 65% of Republicans said, no, we don't want any cuts to Medicaid. But here you go. This is another example of how the Republicans are going against what their own constituents want. Why? Because they want the money from their donors. They want to satisfy their donors. This is what they do. So here, keeps on lying and lying and lying. A majority of Americans don't support cuts to the Medicaid program, nor do they support a work requirement. Again, a majority of those people on Medicaid are already working. They don't need a work requirement. All right, now I wanted to look back at Mikey J's own district in Louisiana. Because remember last week I mentioned that Louisiana is the second highest state by percentage of population to be on the Medicaid program. 32.4%. So that's just about 1 in 3 people, or a third of the people in Louisiana, have health insurance through the Medicaid program. Okay, that's not some small number. That's 1 in 3. That's a third of the people. So that's about 1.4 million people in Louisiana. Apparently, these 1.4 million people in Louisiana are all committing fraud, according to Mikey J. Okay. Now, Mike Johnson's specific district, his legislative district, his congressional district, 290,000 people are covered under in his district. That's nearly 40% of the people in his district. So, again, big number, 40%. How many of those people are going to lose coverage? A lot of them are, because Mike Johnson doesn't care about them. He's going to get his tax break on the backs of the poor people in his district and other districts, as well as the middle class, the rest of us. I've gone through this before with who's going to win under these tax cuts. It's not us. Matter of fact, I'll get to this here in a bit too. The bottom 20% of the people are going to make less money, and then the next 20% are going to have to pay more in taxes as well. So, what he's not talking about, what Republicans are not talking about when they are going to do these cuts, is all the rural hospitals that are going to close. Well, why are they going to do that? Well, they're not going to get this Medicaid money. They're not going to get Medicaid reimbursements. And I talked before about how the hospitals are against this. Now, where's the morality in this, Mikey? Of the top 10 Republican districts, with Medicaid coverage. 4 of them are in Louisiana, including Johnson's. What lies are they going to be telling their constituents when they kick them off the program? What are they going to tell them when their, grandpa and grandpa get kicked out of the nursing home and they got to come and live with you now? Right? What's going to happen to the kids who got cancer treatments paid through Medicaid and they're going to get kicked off now? What if that's your kid? Where's the morality in that, Mikey? What are you going to tell them? You're going to tell them they don't deserve it, apparently. And these rich people deserve their tax breaks. You're the one saying there in the debate on the bill that, quote, we're going to be very careful not to cut a benefit for anyone who is eligible to receive it and relies on it, close quote. I don't think so, Mike. Everyone meets that standard. Everyone that's using it already, Mike, is already meeting that standard. Medicaid is an income-based program, remember. You know this. You either meet it or you don't. Again, this is why they are adding the work requirement to try and kick some people off who are otherwise eligible. They're trying to kick them off. By the way, what is the minimum wage in Louisiana? $7.25 an hour. It's the federal wage. This is one reason why it's one of the poorest states in the United States. But here's the sad part. Johnson won election in 2024 with 86% of the vote in his district. So, again, talked about this before, too, is like Republicans keep winning in rural areas or poor areas by huge margins. Like, what are these people thinking of? 22% of the district live in poverty, but yet he gets 86% of the people voting for him. Why do they vote for this guy? They're not going to raise your wages. You're getting the lowest minimum wage you can right now. They're not going to help you pay for your insurance. They're trying to kick you off of this. They're taking more money from poor people and transferring it to the top 1%. Why are you voting for these people? The Republican Party doesn't support human dignity by what they're doing. Now, remember, they can say all the stuff they want, but you got to focus on what the actions are that they're actually doing. So Mike Johnson, he's not going to go out there and say, you're going to lose Medicaid coverage because I need, the money to fund the tax cuts. He's not going to say that. The top 1%, the top 1/10 of 1% get an average of over $389,000 in tax cuts in 2026, while the lowest 20% of workers lose $1,000. And those making between $17,000 and $51,000 are going to lose $700 a year. In other words, their taxes are going up to fund the tax cuts for the rich people. By the way, some of those tax cuts, and nobody's talking about this hardly either, some of these tax cuts go in after the 2026 election. So they're trying to avoid losing the 2026 midterms, so they can say, well, this stuff doesn't happen until a little later. You can't blame us for this. They're going to blame Democrats for this, right? So don't be fooled by this. Finally, if all this fraud is going on, Mikey, where's all the criminal charges for fraud here? You would think if there's millions of people committing fraud out there like he claims, why aren't you prosecuting all these people? Well, because they're not. Just like Doge's claim that all these people are committing fraud. They're not. Okay, the ones who are committing Medicaid fraud is mostly the hospitals, the doctors, and the insurance companies. It's not the patients. As I mentioned before, studies have shown Medicaid and Medicare are more efficient than a private healthcare system, with a fraud rate of less than 1%. So let's be clear about what's going to happen here. If this bill happens, people are going to die, Mike. Prices are going to go up. There's going to be more people filing for bankruptcy. They can't pay their medical bills. Right? There's going to be rural hospitals closing. What can you do about this? Well, stop voting for Republicans. Right? They're not public servants trying to increase the number of people getting health care coverage. They're only looking to kick people off who don't deserve it in their mind. Okay, don't forget that. Use your voice at the polls. All right, so that's it for this segment. I'll probably talk about that more, too, as time goes on. So when I come back, I'm going to talk about fascism and how the Republican Party, and by what they're doing and what Trump is doing, are doing textbook fascism stuff. So we'll talk about that on the other side. All right, welcome back to the third segment here of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So for this segment, I'm going to start doing I'm not going to be doing it every week, but I'm going to start doing a segment called This Week in Republican Fascism, where I'm going to talk through some issues that the Republicans and the Trump administration, but as I said last week, you got to lump in the Republicans on all this stuff because they're enabling all this stuff to happen. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways that they are doing textbook fascism by what they're doing. Okay? So this first thing, for this segment, I'm going to be doing that the Republicans are going after the colleges and universities. Right? Particularly Harvard, right? That's the one that's making the big news. But they're going after other schools. Let's not forget that. But I'm going to use Harvard as an example here. So in April, they went after Harvard and other schools, freezing federal research grants to these schools because they refused to bend the knee to their Republican demands, to change their admission standards, to change their disciplinary process and governance policies. Basically the Republicans demanded that Harvard and other schools let them basically take over and run the school. All right. So Columbia, remember, they basically bent the knee. They're like, yeah, okay, you can do some of this stuff. Well, Harvard and some others, but Harvard said, no, we're not going to do this. And they filed a lawsuit, and they won, at least so far, right? A lot of again, as I've said before, these are temporary cases, injunctions right now because they have the lawsuits that are going on. But courts did a restraining order saying, no, you can't take away this money. And these funds have, because they've already been appropriated to the schools by Congress as part of their research grants. So that part didn't work, at least not so far. So then the Republicans and Trump tried to block foreign students from going to Harvard. You may have heard that recently. Well, a federal judge has blocked that too, as it turns out, recently. What the Republicans tried to do here was say, well, Harvard, you can't take any more foreign students. And that's roughly 27% of the students at Harvard are so-called foreign students. And they even wanted to create foreign student lists so that the Trump administration could decide how radicalized lunatics should not be let back into our country. In other words, they would get this list. Someone from the Trump administration would look at these people and decide who to kick out and who to keep. Right, and this is the words that they're using. So they could decide how radicalized lunatics should not be let back into our country. That's what was one of Trump's tweets. So again, federal judges block that. Now they want to cancel all federal contracts that are in place. Doesn't matter, not just the research grants that they were talking about before, but now they want to do all grants or all contracts that the federal government has with Harvard. Well, again, they're going to get sued because of this. They're going to get sued for nothing else, for breach of contract. I mean, you can't just decide you're going to break contracts. You probably have to have cause. You have to have a reason to cancel all, these contracts. And, they don't have evidence for all this stuff, right? I mean, the claim that they use all the time is, well, there were people protesting against Israel. There were, these are just anti-Semitic people running all over these, schools. When in fact they're not. Yeah, there may be some, but not to the extent that, Trump and Republicans make it sound like. So, I assume Harvard's probably already filed a lawsuit against this. And they'll probably win that one too. The Republicans are mad that Harvard just isn't giving in to their demands. So they're trying to come up with all these different ways to make Harvard bend the knee. And other schools, right? They're starting here with Harvard because they're going to use, if it works, they're going to use the same process on other schools. Right? And remember, the University of Minnesota is on their list. Okay, I've mentioned that before. But the problem they always run into, they're making all these claims, but they got no evidence to support it. And you need evidence in court. Right? So fascist politics, what they're doing here is they're trying to undermine public discourse by attacking and devaluing education, expertise, and language. They're going after education here because they think all these colleges are liberal bastions of, Democrats everywhere, right? Well, actually, they're not. I mean, the Republican Party is funding all kinds of conservative departments at hundreds of colleges, if not thousands of colleges across the country. What the Republicans are doing here is they want people to be less educated, plain and simple. Well, why? Well, so that these people don't think critically about what the Republicans are actually doing to the country and to the individual people themselves. A little bit of what I talked about in the last segment. Plus, uneducated people are easily manipulated. I mean, Trump was out, said during the campaign he loves the uneducated people. This is what they're trying to do here. Plus, they want private schools and charter schools to teach the Republican ideology, and the, Christian ideology in our schools. And they're going after science, expertise. They want to get rid of that too. They want to get rid of a person's power of reason to make it easier to control these people. With the emotions, right? That's what they're doing. This is how they do their campaigns. Let's get people looking at their emotions rather than their reasoning strategy. So, don't believe what this fascist regime tells you. It's probably actually the opposite of what they say. We'll talk to you next week.